There is an increased uptick in 5G smartphones, especially in Tier 2 markets. Now, such is the love of 5G smartphones that e-commerce giant Amazon's sales in the first quarter of the year were primarily driven by it. Now, according to media reports, strong demand from Tier 2 market for 5G smartphones is boosting smartphone sales to a double-digit growth for Amazon India. The double-digit growth came in during the first 3 months of the year, which is the first quarter of 2023, according to various reports. Now, while Amazon has posted impressive growth, the company continued to trail behind rival Flipkart in terms of accepting shipments from brands during the same quarter. While the online channels accounted for 44% of the shipment in first quarter, a majority was taken by Walmart-owned Flipkart, according to a Counterpoint research. On the show today, what's driving India's 5G obsession? What does the growth in rural market means for e-commerce players? And who's winning the battle in smartphone market? Joining me at this point in time is Lloyd Mathias, who's a brand expert. Also with me in the studio is Kartik. Kartik, thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much.
It looks like there is a constant battle that has been playing out in the smartphone market, but the battle at this stage is in rural India as opposed to urban India, what we would expect.
Actually, even in urban India, because I think as you started reading, Shomalio got so excited that he really chucked his phone down, and that's the little noise interruption that we saw. So I think he wants to upgrade to a 5G phone as well. But yeah, interesting times, Shweta, and it sort of reminds me to this largely infamous Veer Das stand-up comedy in New York, if I'm not mistaken, where he quite discreetly said that I live in two Indias. And I think that seems to be the case here as well. We live in two Indias. There is one India where you have the likes of Tim Cook coming over, inaugurating these huge Apple stores in prime locations in Mumbai and Delhi, and selling phones upwards of 1 lakh rupees and well beyond that. At the same time, you have this great demand of 5G phones coming not from these urban centers, but from Tier 2 cities. At the same time, there's another angle to the story. Again, I live in two Indias. There's one India where there is a CAIT, Confederation of All India Traders, up in arms always against big tech and large e-commerce giants, saying that it's going to sort of, undo the large market of retail stores and kirana stores, and in general, the mom and pop stores run in Tier 2, Tier 3 cities. At the same time, you have demand for these very smart phones, which are high value purchases, which are fairly involved buying behavior, actually coming from these Tier 2 cities, and the shopping not really happening as much offline as one would expect traditionally, but happening online.
Okay.
So interesting sort of contrasts we get to see in society.
Absolutely. Various different pictures emerging from rural India, urban India. I want to bring in Lloyd at this point in time. Lloyd, just before this discussion, in fact, this morning, we were discussing as to the kind of hullabaloo we saw around Apple's India stores launch, and one view was that it is going to lead to a spur in iPhone makers sales in India. But from what we are looking at right now, it appears that whether a physical store or an absence of physical store, Indians are already buying smartphones. What sort of value do the physical stores then have? That's my question number one. And question number two is, what do you make of the fact that rural India perhaps is consuming more data, buying more smartphones, and going big for 5G as opposed to, not so much as urban India?
Thanks for having me on your show, Shweta, and it's great to be here. To answer the two questions, I think in any purchase, specifically in the category of mobile phones and smartphones, I think there's a complementary between the offline presence and online. I know there are brands that have chosen to try to go online only and have met with some success. I think long-term consumers still like the look and feel of walking into a store, asking questions to a real-world agent, or a shop salesman, just the feeling that something is there. So I think brands that have a long-term strategy in India recognize the importance of having physical stores, and obviously a few flagship stores where they can showcase their entire, or experience stores as they call it. Right? So clearly, I think what Tim Cook did last month, launching a couple of stores, was really establish that very clearly and establish Apple's commitment to India as a significant market. I think that process is done. The second part, I think, really is tied into India's growth in telecom. And clearly we all seen the big point of inflection was 2016 when Jio came in and made voice free. But more importantly, drove data to the extent that India still remains today the international market with the lowest cost of data. And what that has done is really driven the use of data. So today, Indians are the biggest guzzlers of data in the world. And on the back of it, we've seen a whole rise of the internet economy. The fact that about 750 million Indians today are technically on the internet, and at least more than 60% of them are transacting in some form or the other. So I think this growth was inevitable from 2016. I think what we're seeing in the last couple of years, albeit briefly interrupted by the pandemic in 2020 and 21, is the growth has been powered by the tier 2 markets. As e-commerce is reaching down thanks to a lot of logistics and third-party delivery providers to smaller towns, I think a lot of the growth is being driven from there. And what the pandemic did was really demonstrate that a whole lot of services, starting with education, healthcare, government services, can actually be delivered through the phone. So I think a combination of this has really kind of exploded the market. And what we are seeing right now is a lot of growth coming out of tier 2 markets. One additional factor is what the government calls the CSCs, the common service centers, where a lot of government services. So even people who don't really have great connectivity the last mile can actually go to the common service center with their smartphones and devices and actually get a whole lot of things done, right from booking an IRCTC ticket, to getting very basic documentation like birth certificates and such like.
Okay. Do you know something interesting you mentioned, and Kartik, going back to your analogy of two Indias, I think you mentioned multiple Indias.
That's his original analogy, but I'll give you credit for it.
I'll give you the credit for it. I think focusing particularly on rural India, the trend that we are seeing as per data and figures that we have is that the growth for e-commerce players, largely Flipkart, Amazon, the two big e-commerce players, is coming on the back of smartphone sales from rural India.
Tier 2.
Tier 2. Tier 2 cities, smaller cities, as opposed to large urban metro cities. This largely also talks about the consumption that we are seeing in these areas. And also, I want you to briefly touch upon the fact that we keep discussing rural demand, we keep discussing demand in tier 2, tier 3 cities as perhaps an indicator of how rural economy is doing in general. And from what this data suggests is perhaps that economy is doing better when it comes to consumption of data, consumption of electronics, if this is the indicator that we draw our inference from.
Sure. So actually there are a couple of indicators. I don't think mobile purchases is a formal indicator yet.
But what it
tells you is that data usage is definitely on a rise. What it also goes to show is that, owning a device today, a smart device, is actually a necessity.
Okay.
And you're consuming a lot of entertainment, information, knowledge, communications, everything is actually happening through that device. What is also interesting to note here is that the lion's share for tier 2 cities is actually in mobile phones which are more expensive than 15,000 rupees.
Okay.
So higher price value than 15,000. Up until now, the common understanding was that 15,000 and above is more of an urban phenomena, whereas anything below 15,000 is rural, and maybe you could extrapolate that to tier 3, tier 2 cities as well. But that doesn't seem to be the case anymore. So 15,000 and above is a fairly significant price point for an individual in a tier 2 city to invest in a mobile phone which is 5G ready. Right, and the kind of influence is going to shape for his existence or her existence and her life is significant. And with 5G, of course, the whole more speed, better streaming quality, all of that sort of enhances the quality of life of a person. What we also understand is that the longevity of a device like a cell phone is much longer in a tier 2, tier 3 city than it is in urban. So the frequent changes that we guys presumably often make to our devices is not something we see there.
Okay.
So for somebody who's buying a 15,000 rupee phone, and there are some data points that also indicate even 30,000 and higher phones are seeing a larger uptake in rural cities and tier 2 cities, it sort of goes on to show that people are going to hold on perhaps to these devices for long.
Okay.
And there is one more interesting trend that I picked up in the counterpoint research that you referred to. So what is happening is that deep discounting is something which is fairly prevalent in e-commerce, right? And that is why CAIT is always up in arms against these very large e-commerce players. Now what happens is sometimes you go to a mobile store, a physical brick and mortar mobile store, and you look at all the various models available. You have a price budget, let's say 15,000 to 18,000 is the range. You look at all available brands, all available options, camera quality, 5G compatibility, battery life, this, that. You look at all the parameters and you hone on to the device that you really want to buy. And then immediately from your existing device, you go to one of these Flipkart or Amazon players and you see the price difference. Now the guy in the shop is quoting 18,000 rupees, you get it for 17,500, you place your order there.
Absolutely. And this is an interesting point, and I want to bring Lloyd in as well. Lloyd, I think, and we were discussing this, as I mentioned, the need for a physical retail store. Kartik made a very interesting analogy. He said that you go to a retail physical store to look at the device, to feel the device, to see if it's compatible with you and to see if it meets your need, but you're actually then going online and buying it from the e-commerce,
if you get a price advantage
whatever the e-commerce portal is, because you're expected to get a price advantage. Right. Which brings us to the competitive pricing. Also, as many brick and mortar businesses would say, a predatory pricing, because it hurts their businesses. Do you think that also applies to big metro towns? Is there some data to suggest that? And more importantly, what is then viability of the mom and pop shops in small, relatively tier 2, tier 3 cities, and big retail physical stores in Delhi, in Mumbai?
Yeah, I think that was a great point Kartik brought out. I think the reality is that consumers across the spectrum live in what we call an omni-channel world. We're constantly toggling between the real world and our digital worlds. And it's perfectly normal for every subscriber, right? From a value-conscious subscriber to someone buying something very expensive, you always quickly go and check. I want to make 2 points. I think one is the fact that brick and mortar adds a certain sense of stability. I think that is proven beyond a point. The second, which is really backing this increased demand in tier 2 markets, is that a lot of the groundwork in the last few years have been done not just by the big 2 majors, Amazon and Flipkart, but a whole series of smaller local apps in the e-commerce place actually got consumers starting to get involved with e-commerce with much smaller, low-value transactions. So ranging from local apps to even the likes of the Meeshos and the Snapdeals actually deal with a whole range of unbranded products predominantly. They also sell the big name tickets, but a lot of their ticket sizes tend to be much smaller, and therefore they are actually getting people onto the e-commerce bandwagon, from where people are now getting familiar, saying that, hey, it's time to buy a slightly more expensive. And that's the typical curve that people go through in e-commerce. Initially, you buy relatively cheap, low-risk items, and once you're confident, people start climbing up the value curve. It's the fact that in cities today, people buy a lot of televisions, refrigerators, air conditioners out of e-commerce. So I think that climbing process is what we see as one significant driver. The second, like I said before, and I think is important to reiterate, is the fact that as a range of services, entertainment options starts moving through the 5G pipe, people find much more significant uses for their phone. The phone no longer, say about a decade back, was an indulgence for someone in a small town whose economic sustenance was not so great. I think today they do a lot more, right? It's a tool of work. It's a thing that entertain themselves. It's sometimes used in some form of education. It's a place where they can book tickets, can do a whole lot of things. So I think the basket of things that one can do out of e-commerce has widened significantly. I think that's another thing that's carrying this increased growth in tier 2 markets.
Lloyd, I just want to touch upon another interesting, term that I stumbled upon in the Counterpoint research, and there's something called live e-commerce. And from what I understand, it's stated that live e-commerce is when this influencer takes on to social media for a duration of 15 to 20 minutes and announces this flash sale and gives out these discount coupons to immediately prop up the sale of a certain device or so. How significant is this phenomenon, and where else are we seeing this sort of, get the sort of coverage apart from mobile devices in e-commerce?
Thanks for bringing out that point, Kartik. I think absolutely bang on. I think live commerce or social commerce is a trend that's growing. And very strangely, it's growing on 2 ends of the spectrum. One is obviously are these ultra cutting edge urban influencers who possibly once a week, let's say a well-known personality comes and says, today I'm going to showcase the latest in watches or the latest in fashion trends. And it's like a live ticker at the bottom where people can do spot buying. It's the equivalent of the early kind of catalog shopping on television that used to happen, right? When you had those people selling the standard, build your muscle kind of equipment that kind of went, round the clock on television when you switched on. other end of the spectrum, this is also picking up, I'm told, very significantly in smaller markets. So the spread of short format video, which has become a huge entertainment tool. The TikTok-alike kind of shows where people are watching those 30, 40, 60 seconders made by local people, each of with a significant following, have now begun to incorporate e-commerce. So brands are tapping these small local influencers who are now showcasing interesting new devices, interesting new things, which you can order with one click straight from your phone. So it's like a seamless transaction where this influencer will talk about this new, and let's say, makeup device or a new cosmetic, and with one click in a day or two, you actually get that product. So there is a bit of social commerce that may also be driving this. I know for a fact that it's a big trend in the cities. I'm feeling it might be one of the key drivers in semi-urban and rural India as well.
Okay. Interesting point there. Live e-commerce, very, very interesting. And concept of flash sales, and perhaps not as Lloyd pointed out, not restricted to one or two such platforms. Large number of new players are getting increasingly involved in flash sales, Kartik, wherein I don't know if you've bought one from a flash sale. I have. People I know I have. They have bought actively from flash sales, getting deep discounting on an item that would otherwise cost them not double, but at least a little bit more, 10%, 5% more in price value. Interesting techniques there that e-commerce players come up with in order to sort of retain their customer base and increase their customer base. And we continue to, of course, talk about the growth of e-commerce players here vis-a-vis the smartphone market. We will track that story and more. Lloyd, Kartik, thanks very much for joining with your inputs on that very important story.